Hello, everyone. I'm Aaron Good, author of American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State, and host of the American Exception podcast on Patreon. This is the very first episode of Devil's Chess Club, our new show. It features David Talbot, author of several books, including The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. That book title is obviously the inspiration for Devil's Chess Club. Joining David and I is a young scholar and journalist, Bryce Green. Bryce writes regularly for fairness and accuracy in reporting. If you want to get first access to Devil's Chess Club episodes, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. After that, you can find these episodes on Rockfin and eventually on YouTube under the Devil's Chess Club channel within American Exception on YouTube. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the very first Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good, along with Bryce Green. Bryce, are you ready for this?
Oh yeah, I've been looking forward to it. This is pretty darn exciting.
Very good, very good. Joining us is our colleague and friend, the author of Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. He is also the inspiration for Devil's Chess Club. I'm talking about David Talbot. David Talbot, it's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Aaron and Bryce.
So, you are a person whose career trajectory is really fascinating to me. And for people that aren't familiar with your work, you had previously been writing for a journalist for a long time, working for Mother Jones, and you founded Salon and had great success at Salon in the early sort of days of internet news. But then you wrote this book, Brothers, about the Kennedy years, and we have I've got the cover right here, and this is the hidden history of the Kennedy years. What led you to write this incendiary book? Because it's a fascinating read, and it tells a story that for some reason didn't get told for 40 years, which is the story of what Robert Kennedy did after his brother's assassination in Dallas. So how did you end up going from left liberal, solidly left liberal person to writing a really radical book like this?
Good question. uh, I think my evolution, began early on when I was a kid. And that year, 1968, was a very important year for me. I was 16 that year. I was in a military school, Harvard Boys School, as it's called at the time, Harvard Westlake now. And I was a volunteer on Bobby Kennedy's campaign for president in 68 as a kid. Uh, the first Bobby Kennedy when he ran here in California and during the primary. And that was a very volatile, very emotional year for me, obviously, and for many, many Americans. Martin Luther King had been killed in April. We thought of Bobby Kennedy as the last hope for our country. And when he was himself assassinated that night, we were up celebrating his victory. I'll always remember it. My fellow activists, young teenage activists, and I, we were smoking weed up on Mulholland Drive and celebrating his victory in the California primary. And then he was killed, of course, later that night. He was shot. And so I felt the ceiling, or the floor rather, was collapsing underneath me. And the country we've been raised to revere, that had some hope because of people like leaders like King and like the Kennedys and Malcolm X, they were all dead. So I think that and the fact I was in a military school at the time really radicalized me, made me very skeptical of where the country was headed, where authority was in this country. And so that began my evolution at the time. I think I've gone between liberalism and radicalism my whole life. Uh, you're right, I started Salon because I thought that the web at that point in the mid 90s really presented the only opportunity for free journalism. And so I was one of the first to recognize that it would be a publishing medium. And thank God that John Warnock, who recently died, the co-founder of Adobe, the big software company, also saw it the same way. Saw that we could, you know, showcase his tools, his publishing tools, as well as he was a believer in free journalism, in independent journalism, and he stood by us through thick and thin. So I was able to do that for a number of years at Salon. And then I felt really a need to go back to writing. I'd run Salon for 10 years. I was exhausted, burned out. As you know, web journalism is very demanding. I was not a kid anymore. By then, I was in my 50s. So I decided to go back to journalism. The mystery that had always haunted me ever since that night when I was a kid in '68 was who killed President Kennedy and who killed Bobby Kennedy and who killed Martin Luther King. Those questions hovered over me and still haunted me. So our friend Karen Croft, who turned out to be my colleague on the book, my researcher on Brothers and my subsequent books, said this was the book I should write. What Bobby Kennedy himself, who was Attorney General, the top lawman in the country in '63, what he felt was behind the killing, the assassination of his beloved brother, JFK. And those people, most of them, were still alive, the Kennedy people. And I interviewed Robert McNamara. I interviewed Arthur Schlesinger, Ted Sorensen, Nick Katzenbach, all the men who had loyally served President Kennedy and some who'd gone on to work with Bobby Kennedy as senator from New York. And they were at the point in their lives, I think, when they felt, fuck it, I'm going to tell the truth about the assassination of President Kennedy, what I suspect really happened. And they leveled with me for the most part. They were honest about their suspicions. And their suspicions fell largely on the national security state, on Kennedy's own government. And they felt that his government had come apart during his presidency, come apart over his intention to end the Cold War with the Soviet Union, with Fidel Castro in Cuba. That was, I think, provoked a strong reaction from his own government, from the Cold Warriors who felt that JFK was putting the country at risk by pursuing a peace deal, back-channel peace negotiations with Moscow and Havana. They knew about it, and they reacted very violently against him, I feel, in November '63. But mostly important, it was what Bobby Kennedy, who knew the dark side of American power better than anybody, as Arthur Schlesinger said, the historian, the aide to President Kennedy, it was what Bobby Kennedy himself suspected. In some ways, as I write in Brothers, Bobby Kennedy was the first conspiracy theorist. He believed that the assassination of his brother was connected to his peace policies, what he was trying to do with Cuba, with the Soviet Union. He felt that the CIA, in particular, Allen Dulles, who was the former director of the CIA, moved against his brother. And he was right.
Right. I recently re-listened to Brothers. I've read the book a couple times, and I have the audiobook version. And it's a great sweeping. You trace the history of the Kennedy years, and you had all of these conversations with so many people, and that were around. I mean, the people that were still alive, and the Bobby's silence, I think, is the fact that he would not comment on this publicly. It points to some realities of our political system that are hard for us to wrap our minds around, because why do you think that he chose to be so quiet about this? Because other people, like people around Jim Garrison, were saying you need to speak about this, because that's your only way to deter them. And when every time that I've reread your book, that part just really sticks with me. The whole like, oh, why didn't you say that you were doing that? Because I mean, Garrison called it. He told Larry King that even as he was like stepping out of the car, Larry King drops him off at the airport, and his last words to Larry King were, "They're gonna kill Bobby," and then he just walks off. But what do you
Yeah,
think was Bobby's thinking on this?
it's a very good question. It goes to the heart of my book, brothers. Why was Bobby Kennedy, apparently silent about the subject that so engulfed him, the assassination of his brother? At first, as I write in Brothers, Bobby Kennedy was devastated emotionally by the assassination. He was, as Jack Newfield, the journalist who was close to Bobby, told me, with that computer like brain of Bobby's, he put together the crime within the first 48 hours. He had Walter Sheridan, his trusted investigator, go to Chicago, look into who Jack Ruby, who shot and killed Oswald, was. He found out, as Frank Mankiewicz, his press secretary as senator from New York, and when he ran for president in '68, told me that when they looked at Jack Ruby's phone records, it was like the Rackets committee witnesses all over again. They were all gangsters. Who he was calling on the phone in the days and hours before he killed Oswald, he was calling other gangsters. So they gave Jack Ruby a mission, a job that he couldn't refuse. He had to kill Oswald. So, when Bobby put it all together within the first 40 hours, he called in John McCone, head of the CIA, said, "Did your outfit do this?" He told, a trusted Cuban exile leader, Harry Ruiz Williams, that your people killed him, meaning Cuban exiles, anti-Castro Cubans were involved. I think he put together this operation. It was directed by the CIA and involved, elements of the underworld and the Cuban exile community. I think he put it together very quickly, Bobby did. And then he descends into a deep depression because he realizes he can't do anything about this. President Johnson has been sworn in as JFK's successor. He hates Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy hates him. J. Edgar Hoover stopped taking his calls at the FBI. He has no power left as Attorney General. His brother did. So there's nothing he could do as Attorney General. And later he, of course, resigns and he runs for the Senate from New York and he wins. At the Senate, as a leader, he quickly embraces other issues, the war in Vietnam, racial justice, poverty, and so on. He realized when he announced, I think dangerously so, in '68 for president, and Jackie Kennedy came to him and said, the same people who killed Jack are going to kill you. He knew what the stakes were in '68. He knew that he was taking big risk by running. And he only had one security guy, Bill Berry, his name was, former FBI agent, who protected him, held on to him when the people literally clawed at him during his public appearances. Bobby Kennedy, I believe, had something of a death wish when he announced in '68. He didn't take proper precautions, security precautions. And when he waded into those crowds, anybody could have killed him. Then finally, he is killed in June 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel. We can talk more about that later. But I believe then that he revealed to people in the campaign he was going to reopen the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination if he made it back to the White House in '68, if he'd been elected president in '68. He told students at a rally at Northridge, California, on the campus there, that he would, he spoke very judiciously, very carefully, but he did say he would take another look at the Warren report and the files that were still hidden. I believe he didn't make this a major issue in his presidential campaign in '68, Bobby, because he knew that it would overwhelm the campaign at that point. And he believed that peace in Vietnam, racial justice, poverty, the issues that he was campaigning on were very, very important and were dividing the country. And only he could have brought together the unique coalition that he did bring together. And you can see that. the people who lined the train tracks when his coffin was carried from New York to Washington, D.C. There were Hasidic Jews, there were nuns, there were Little Leaguers, there were blacks, there were whites, there were men, there were women, there were working class people. A lot of those people later went to, a lot of the white people went to George Wallace, the racist, later when Bobby was killed. So he brought together this amazing cross-spectrum coalition in 68. And I believe he would have, if he'd gone back to the White House, as Adam Walensky told me, he was Bobby's speechwriter and aide. Adam told me during my interview that Bobby was a very serious man. He knew how power functioned. He knew what the risks were. He was not going to say anything about the assassination until he was in a position to do something about it. He would have been in that position as president. Adam also told me that as president, he had limited power. He knew that he may not be able to solve the case, even as president, but he was going to try.
Right. That, to my mind, is when we talk about the deep state, in the academic sense, like as Peter Dale Scott and Ola Tanander and others have worked on, not the Donald Trump, caricature of it. And you look at the Kennedy brothers, they were really fighting the whole in different ways. You had like Kennedy's battle with Wall Street, okay, with the standoff with Steele, where he says, "My dad told me all businessmen were sons of bitches," right? That is a remarkable statement from the U.S. president, because the one overarching theme of U.S. history is that the free enterprise and doing business is like sacrosanct, and that's quite a statement from the president. I guess Roosevelt said some things in that vein, and sometimes Truman would posture that way, but that's really something. So he went at Wall Street in a particular way. He was so alarmed by the bellicosity of the generals that he wanted to get that 7 Days in May made into a movie about generals who would stage a coup, and it was already, he'd helped them to film it, and then he dies before it could even be released. And Bobby himself went after organized crime, and he wanted to get a movie made of his book, The Enemy Within, which really posited that not that we had a problem of like some hoodlums running prostitution rings, but that this was a nationwide systemic issue. It was this dark force, and it's like they were hacking away at different legs or heads of the Hydra, but it's all, as we see now in retrospect, these forces are much more intertwined, and we can almost simplify them and just call them the U.S. empire. There's that criminal element of which the CIA, the criminality is institutionalized. They're kind of indistinguishable from organized crime. Wall Street is out of control. They want to own everything, including all the residential housing and so on. And the military is this enormous colossus with 1,000 bases around the world, and it eats up the whole budget. I mean, how do you think that by the end, Bobby, by putting these things together, similar to MLK with his three triplets, I mean, do you think that JFK and Bobby had a sense of this in a way, and then never really articulated it fully, but like that they really were grappling with this one, not totally unified but not totally separate force? How do you think that factored in?
I think and I just wrote a screenplay about Kennedy's last year in the White House. I can't talk about it any more than that, but I've been immersed in this history all over again. I think that JFK and Bobby, by 1963, did realize what they were up against. He joked, in fact, as you brought up the steel crisis in 62, where he faced off against the entire steel industry. They jacked up the prices against their agreement he thought he had with the steel industry, and he forced them, and he and Bobby, to back down. So the steel industry was furious at Kennedy, and he joked in a speech that they would try to assassinate him in 62. So, he was aware, and you're right, he let the movie 7 Days in May about a military coup be filmed in part at the White House when he was gone. So he wanted John Frankenheimer, the director, and Kirk Douglas, the co-star of that film, to make that movie as a warning Arthur Schlesinger told me, to the American people about the perils he was facing from the right wing, from the military-industrial complex. I think by 63, both Kennedy brothers understood the forces they aroused, how powerful they were, and that they were out to get him, President Kennedy. And but I think because of the wealth and entitlement, like Franklin Roosevelt, they felt they could withstand it. They were too self-assured, I think. And they had always won. They'd been taught to be winners by their father, Joe Kennedy, and they always had won politically. I think they felt they could withstand the heat and overcome these powerful forces that were against them. They didn't. And they were overcome tragically for the country. And the assassinations of both Kennedy brothers and of Martin Luther King in particular, I think, ended the dream the country had in the 60s of a peaceful and a just nation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes that comes through in this entire story when you talk about the Kennedy brothers facing off against, well, not only U.S. steel companies, but the national security state and their hawkish mentality is the nature of like what Peter Dale Scott calls overworld power, this extreme wealth that allows individuals to exercise top-down control in what's, ostensibly a democracy. And the combination of the national security state, massive Wall Street wealth, and industrial wealth. I mean, these are the forces that coalesce to actually affect a change of government. And one of the characters that comes up in this that it really embodies this whole thing is the first civilian CIA director, Mr. Allen Dulles. And the subject of your book, The Devil's Chessboard. You have it right there. I have it in my hand. But this book, to me, was my first introduction to what's called parapolitics. To the idea of a secret government sort of behind the public state that we have. I read it, not expecting to learn anything about the Kennedy assassination. I had when I picked it up all those years ago, I hadn't heard of you. I hadn't really looked into the assassination or thought about it in any depth at all. And so I was reading it and learning about, Allen Dulles and how he's a real piece of shit, and his relationship with his wife, and to the extent that the CIA was able to infiltrate different parts of the government. And that was an important lesson in your book, even before the Kennedy assassination stuff. But when I got to that, that final part 3 of the book, the case that you lay out was absolutely astounding to me. My jaw was on the floor. I was texting my friends. I was like, hey, did you know that the CIA and Allen Dulles was involved in the Kennedy assassination? And some people were like, well, yeah, you didn't know that? While others were like, Bryce, you're talking crazy. Stick to software development or whatever. But it was such an important phase transition, sort of, in my understanding of how democracy in America operates. And one of the big things that you dug into in understanding Allen Dulles' role in the assassination plot at an organizational level was his calendars that were released from, or they were given to and made available by Princeton University. And now Lisa Pease, who we all know and love, she has been recently talking about looking at those calendars again and connecting it with some of the other assassination plots, not just Dallas, but also in Washington, D.C. and in Florida, and I believe in Chicago. And she also talks about how this calendar, after your book came out, disappeared from the Princeton University website. And she says she asks about it, and Princeton said that, we never had any calendar like this before. So can you speak a little bit about that and about any new or interesting revelations or connections that have been made using these calendars and other material that's been coming
out? Thank you, Bryce. Yeah, that's a good question. I did, as you say, extensively use Alan Dulles' own daybook, his calendars, which were indeed at the Princeton Library, and not, as far as I could tell, that expurgated, strangely, to reveal what he was doing that fateful weekend of November 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy is killed in Dallas. Even though Kennedy had fired him 2 years before as CIA director, he's going to a remote CIA facility, top secret facility in Virginia, countryside, known as the Farm, Camp Peary. So he gets himself there, according to his daybook, that weekend that Kennedy is killed and Jack Ruby kills Oswald. He meets, we found out, with a banker. He was head of the banking committee for the Bechtel Corporation, a big construction and engineering firm here in San Francisco, privately held. This banker was also a member of a pro-Nazi bank in the run-up to World War II and during World War II. He and Dulles had served together in the OSS. So according to his own daybook, Dulles meets that weekend for dinner with John Simpson, with this banker. He met before the assassination, in the days before, with other bankers, according to his own daybook, not named. I always wondered who financed the assassination of President Kennedy. Because, of course, you had to fly in shooters, you had to fly in support team, it costs money, you have to pay off people. It's something that can't be officially, of course, budgeted. It has to be off the books. So I believe these bankers who were essentially Dulles' clients, he always served his powerful and wealthy clients very loyally from the time he was a Wall Street lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell to the days he was CIA director. I don't think Alan Dulles was a rogue. He wasn't killing Kennedy on his own. There were powerful people behind him who he served and who financed it. I believe that this money came from people who were very powerful, who wanted Kennedy gone for their own reasons. And Alan Dulles, I believe, orchestrated the crime and then got himself appointed, very importantly, to the Warren Commission, the official body that investigated the assassination. Some people thought, who were observers of the committee, thought that it should have been called the Dulles Commission because he was the only one without a day job. He was the only one who was very active on that commission. And Earl Warren, of course, was the Supreme Court justice, a lot on his plate. But Alan Dulles did not. And he made sure the investigation pinned it on the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who himself told the press before he was killed that I'm a patsy, I'm a fall guy. He knew he was being framed for the murder. He was a low-level intelligence agent, and they decided to frame him for the murder. So Alan Dulles really ran the Warren Commission. He orchestrated the crime and the cover-up, but he did so for very powerful, very wealthy clients.
Right, the amount of money that gets made as a result of this assassination.
And you're right, by the way, Bryce, excuse me, Aaron, you're right that those pages that revealed too much, really, about Alan Dulles' whereabouts the weekend of November 22nd, who he was meeting with, were disappeared, strangely, from Princeton for a time. After I had made copies of them, no one else could. They were gone. And the Princeton Library was evasive about this. Another independent Kennedy researcher found them, thank God, with great help from a librarian there, did the diligent work that was necessary to dig them up again. So they are now available once again, what Dulles was doing that weekend. But they knew how explosive this was after my book came out. And those pages, somebody hid them quite well for a time.
And they were partially redacted, correct? But the farm was left unredacted for some reason. Maybe it would have been more suspicious if, November 22nd, Alan Dulles' whereabouts were redacted. maybe they were just relying on the fact that people don't know exactly what the farm is unless you're like a deep CIA researcher.
I don't think that whoever went through his papers and went through his documents realized how explosive that could be to a skeptical researcher like myself. Um, that's the way the CIA operates. When they can't change reality, they change the record. So Alan Dulles himself, as they write in the Devil's Chessboard, flew down to Missouri, where President Truman was retired. He'd written a very explosive op-ed in the Washington Post after Kennedy was killed, saying the CIA is out of control. They're killing people, they're overthrowing governments, they're doing things that I never intended when I created the CIA as president in 1947. That was a very volatile, explosive, as I say, op-ed. So Dulles flies down to meet with the old man, Truman, says, hey, you didn't mean to say this, did you? You should retract it and take it back because it's very, very controversial what you wrote. Truman stood his ground and said, no, I meant every word. You're not going to, I'm not going to retract it. So Dulles flew back to Washington. He did the second best thing. He wrote for the CIA a document saying that Truman had taken back what he said. An aide who was not responsible wrote it for Truman. He didn't know what it was really in the op-ed. He's quite old. He's kind of out of it. So in other words, Alan Dulles altered the record about Truman, about this op-ed, because he couldn't alter the reality. That's what the CIA does.
Yeah, when I think about the shift of getting rid of Kennedy and what it set off for this class of the overworld of private wealth, I mean, among other things, you have Indonesia 65 and that whole debacle there where the West Papua had resource wealth beyond imagining. Really, they had the biggest oil deposit in the region, but also world history's biggest gold mine that Kennedy wasn't even aware of, and Sukarno of Indonesia wasn't even aware of, but Alan Dulles was. You have the vast fortunes made by military contractors in the Vietnam War, and I mean, as a consequence, it blows up the Bretton Woods system, and you get this system that replaces it that gives Wall Street even more power. I mean, kind of exponentially so. I mean, this turning point is one of the most consequential things.
The Cold War was a racket and made millions and billions for a certain number of people, for the military-industrial complex, for Wall Street. So when Kennedy threatened this Cold War racket, and that's what it was, people making a lot of money, getting a lot of power from it, demonizing the Soviet Union, threatening nuclear war with them, they thought they could actually win a nuclear war. 20 million, 30 million American casualties was winnable to them. They were out of their fucking mind. JFK knew it. He confronted people like Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force. Curtis LeMay wanted a nuclear war when we had superiority over the Soviet Union in the early 60s. He pressured President Kennedy towards a nuclear war. President Kennedy said this guy was out of his mind. He didn't want to be in the same room with him. So the Cold War made many people a fortune. And Kennedy was threatening that when he tried to end the Cold War with the Soviet Union, with Fidel Castro in Havana. He did this by opening back channels. He was deathly afraid, Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter, told me, of accidental nuclear war breaking out, of a Holocaust on his watch as president. In fact, that's why he ran, according to Sorensen, for president in 1960, because he was a student of history. He had read about World War I. He knew what superpowers were capable of, how they could stumble into a fiasco like World War I. And it even was exponentially worse, of course, in the nuclear age, potentially. So JFK was very concerned about this. When he tried to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union, and he gave the famous peace speech at American University in June 1963, in which we said we all cherish our children. He was speaking of our Cold War enemy, the Russians. We all breathe the same air, and we're all mortal. That's amazing rhetoric for a president to identify with the enemy that way at the height of the Cold War. When he gave speeches like this, when he signaled that he was intending to end the Cold War, these men, powerful men, knew they had to move against him, and they did.
Right, and the military men seem like very aggressive, and they've had this very kind of black and white and violence tool mentality. The other people like Dulles is not of that mind. I mean, I think Dulles ultimately would understand more than LeMay would that if you blow up the world, it's not positive for you and your
You can't
backers.
get rich.
Right, but I mean, it was a Cold War. This to me is a power that we have to understand, is the power to create mythical realities that everybody has to accept. Like the Cold War, in retrospect, seems like just a cover story for a major global racket. It's a way of turning international politics into a massive racket and the U.S. has to keep some vassals happy, like and protect their capital too, the former colonial powers. But I mean, it just seems like a cover story for neo-colonialism, and that the world hasn't moved on. We're still, it's the century of the common man that Henry Wallace argued for. Even a century of the sovereign nation state that's able to pursue its own development, as that being the common thing. We haven't gotten to that point. And so, what? How do you relate an individual like Dulles to these bigger forces? What do you think is the significance of the individual operator, and how do you think that you can illuminate so much by looking at a character like this?
Well, I think, Aaron, smartly, and for the most part, I think you're right. Draw back to the American Empire. The American Empire, the Cold War sort of empire, as it was in the 50s and 60s, was all about American power and controlling the rest of the world, their destiny. And Kennedy, by giving speeches, as I said, like the peace speech, he also gave a very important speech out west when he came out here, saying that we can't control the rest of the world anymore. We're a multipolar world. We have more than just the superpowers threatening the world with our weapons and our power. And we have to learn to lead with our values instead, with democracy and peace. That again was very threatening rhetoric to them, because as you and I both know, fortunes were made off this. And even today, we're in a permanent state of war, as Stuart Mill said at the height of the Cold War, famous sociologist, as I write in the book. In the 1950s, early 60s, he was writing. And, it's permanent war. We've had endless war my whole life, ever since Kennedy was killed, someplace or another. Now it's China has been demonized. Russia's demonized. We're pouring billions of dollars into the war in Ukraine, this god-awful war that's only killing people on both sides, bogging down, and just killing civilians, killing children, women, old men. Terrible, awful war, just grinding on and on. And the only people benefiting are the military-industrial complex, the people pouring money and guns and missiles and weapons into this nation, this poor nation that's been caught between these two superpowers. It's what Bobby Kennedy Jr. has said is a proxy war. And his own son went and volunteered for the Ukrainian military, was a machine gunner with them for a year. So he knows all about the war from a personal side as well. So it's a terrible war. Putin should never have invaded, but we should never have gotten to that point where NATO and the West threatened Putin and Russia so much that he felt he had to invade Ukraine. It was the final line that they had crossed, NATO and the West. So yes, does the racket continue today with China, with Ukraine, whatever hotspot in Africa we declare? Yes, we pour guns, military advisors all around the world. As you said, we maintain nearly 1,000 military bases around the world. American still thinks of itself as an empire, while we bomb we drone, as Bobby Kennedy Jr. said, China's building dams, building schools, building hospitals. That's what we should be doing. That's what Martin Luther King said nearly over 50 years ago, that we're in mortal danger of losing our soul as a nation because we spend more money on killing people than educating them.
Yeah, yeah, it still holds true today. Now, I want to talk about another book of yours, which is not quite as germane to the subject matter that we usually cover here, but I just listened to it, the audiobook version, and it happened to be read by the same person who did my own book, which made it I probably made me happier also. The guy's pretty good. Arthur Morey is his name. And this is it's the season of the witch, and it's about San Francisco in the 60s up through the 80s. And this was not about the global empire, although politics plays a big part in it. This book came out about 10 years ago, and you have another column on this, so we can probably talk more about a column coming on this, you told me. We can probably talk more about this in a future episode, but because I had just listened to it, I had this prepared to ask you. So maybe without spoiling too much of your column, what are your reflections on Season of the Witch in San Francisco 10 years later after the publication of your book?
Well, thank you, Aaron. I still live in this crazy city, San Francisco, and I wrote that book from my heart. They were stories I told my kids when I drove them across town to school in the morning. So that book flowed out of me. I'd written it in my head. And as you know, it's all about how San Francisco was the center of my universe as a kid growing up, as a teenager, the summer of love, the hippie revolution. I loved what was happening in the city against sort of a white Catholic old boys network that ran the city. And then, of course, San Francisco descended into madness and chaos in the 70s, and a long, dark period of political violence, assassinations. Everything that was happening in the country at large was happening here in this small city, rather small, city magnified. And then came out the other end and became the city of, quote, San Francisco values, the city of love and tolerance and compassion and enlightenment. So in ways, as I say, it's my bloody Valentine to the city I live in and I love. My son, Joe Talbot, directed and co-wrote the movie The Last Black Man in San Francisco. So he extended our family's connection to the city. And as you know, that film is about the gentrification of San Francisco and how the Black population has been driven out of the city because it's become so unaffordable. So I think that's one of the great calamities that's befallen San Francisco in recent years is the widening wealth gap between rich and poor. On the one hand, you have this tech revolution that's colonized the city. So you have these tech billionaires who live quite nicely. And then you have this burgeoning homeless population on the streets. I just went to one of my favorite bookstores, and on the street, on the corner next to it, is a homeless encampment, a very sad, bedraggled one, needles on the street, used needles, people living in tents, the way that no human being should be forced to live in. It's like the third world. This was 2 blocks from this palatial city hall that we gold domed city hall where our city leaders work and every day. So the city, as Bobby Kennedy told me when we had lunch, Bobby Kennedy Jr., a couple of months ago, he used to come here with his father and his family all the time, and they loved San Francisco in the 60s and so on. It was a great town. It was full of energy. I remember it well, and vitality and clean and nice, and you wanted to come here. Of course, it had lots of problems too underneath the surface, but there weren't homeless people living on the streets in tents like this. There weren't blocks of stores boarded up. There wasn't a kind of ghost town feeling to the city. So it breaks my heart to walk around, to drive around these days and see what's become of the city. Yes, we do have a liberal leadership. We have a mayor, African-American woman, London Breed, who supposedly is progressive, is leading the city, but she's owned by the tech billionaires. She's owned by the wealthy. She does what they tell her. So I think the city desperately needs new visionary leadership, needs a new, I think, revolution, like there was back in the 60s and early 70s.
Right. Yeah, I've only been to San Francisco, 3 times or so, which is more than I've been to any other place on the West Coast. But the tech, the story that you tell ends in the 90s, I think, with the kind of resolution of the AIDS crisis and the discovery of treatments for AIDS. But the book, it's the first really not deep political book that I've read or listened to in a while, with one exception. I read a book on Ricky Henderson, which is also Bay Area related too. And I really enjoyed
the
the
great
Henderson.
Oakland A's baseball player.
Yes, he was my favorite player growing up, and then but then to read about him now that I'm older, you have a whole different perspective on these things. But
I was
Season of
there
the
when he
Witch,
broke the stolen base record.
you were at the park?
I was in the ballpark that day.
Oh, and he said that about Lou Brock, and he said Lou Brock is right there, and Ricky said, "I'm the greatest of all time." But
He
I
was a
still
great
have.
player, great athlete.
He was. I have sympathy for him because he was. In retrospect, he comes across as an egomaniac, not for no reason, but when you look at what he actually ended up doing, Brock had 900 something. Ricky retires with I think 1,600 or 1,400. I mean, that's a guy who is whatever, he's wired differently, and I don't think we can judge him because he's extraordinary. But I don't want to derail this by soliloquizing about Ricky Henderson. My point about your book was, and the audiobook version of it, I hadn't listened to an audiobook that I was sad about ending the way that I was with your book, and the end, when I was finished with it, I was like, I'm bummed that it's over, because the way you take people through the all these crazy episodes, like the Symbionese Liberation Army, and the Jonestown business, and a lot of it is and Harvey Milk, stories that I knew about but didn't know about as much in depth. And then you bring it to the 49ers, which is good because I had an affection for Montana and Ronnie Lott, Roger Craig, and all those guys. And so you tie all these things together. And what do you think is the importance of just stories about human beings and so on? Because I really, it's grim when you look at all this heavy stuff all the time, and it's not like this is light reading exactly, but you're really a master of the narrative and the human element in these. What do you think makes that? Why do you think that this is important for people, even people who want to understand politics and want to communicate about politics? How do you think of these things?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think about this as a writer and as a father and as an activist all the time. What are we leaving behind? I'm 71 years old. I'm no kid. So I think about this a lot. And giving people a sense of hope, I think, is very, very important. So yes, the Devil's Chessboard, in laying out how power works in America, was a very dark book. Very angry book. I wrote with a lot of anger. I wrote Season of the Witch in a very different frame of mind, with great hope and love. And it's a story, as you say, of how we liberated one city. People did. And people power. People in the streets, suffering, fighting, brought about a new city for a time. It's unfortunately now, as I said earlier, fallen back in many ways. It's not what it once was, but we could still liberate it again. And so I told my kids these stories, and they don't like to hear all the dark stories about my past, about the assassinations and all that. It bums them out, frankly. And I think if you dwell on just the darkness, it really does, and it immobilizes you. So I think to really get people active, to really get them fighting, you have to give them a sense of hope of what change could be. That's why I believe in presidential campaigns like Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s. Even if they end tragically, I still believe that people like Martin Luther King and the Kennedy brothers were meant to take us to a higher place. And we have to remember that again. We are capable of doing that again as a people. And it only happens at certain times and only is sustained longer than Occupy or Black Lives Matter for certain times, for certain reasons. But partly, Aaron and I, you agree with me on this. Leadership is very important. You know, my last book was By the Light of Burning Dreams. It was a book about the political movements that challenged power in the 60s and how they won to a certain extent. Not totally, of course, but to a certain extent. So I was able to hang out with Black Panther leaders like Bobby Seale, did a long interview with Bobby, with leaders of the American Indian movement, and who told me all about Wounded Knee, the great action where they withstood the fusillade of Nixon's military and police for days and days, and lived to fight another day. Was a precursor of Standing Rock and other Indian actions. And I wrote that book with my sister, Margaret, who's a great writer. She did the New Yorker magazine, Margaret Talbot. And we wanted to give people a sense of hope, how, you know, in the 60s and 70s, people actually accomplished certain things. And leadership, like Bobby Seale, like Dennis Banks of the American Indian Movement, Russell Means, like Heather Booth, who led a great underground abortion movement in the when it was illegal in the early 70s and late 60s in Chicago. We want to give people a sense of liberation, of what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sense of hope, especially right now, is, I mean, extremely important, because for most people in America, especially, it feels like these times are like almost hopeless. I mean, the empire, the world that we were sold in marketing material when we were growing up. I mean, it isn't shaping out how it was told to be. Like, our living standards are declining. You know, deaths of despair are rising. Discontent with the system is, is skyrocketing. And on a global stage, you know, we're seeing all sorts of disasters, like the Ukraine war. You know, we don't even know how many people are dying there, but, you know, estimates point to 500,000, could be way more than that. And, you know, in Europe, we're seeing Emmanuel Macron use rhetoric like we're not going to be American vassals anymore. And, you know, the population of like France and Germany, they're saying that, well, NATO was partially responsible for this war. We're seeing, you know, anti-French and anti-European, kind of anti-Western in general, movements in Africa, like this coup in Niger. We're seeing all sorts of things. But the only kind of hope for most people in the world to get out from under the thumb of this American empire is the new system developing in the East, like the BRICS bloc, which we were talking about earlier a little bit. But, you know, we have countries like Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, India, and the BRICS countries themselves, and they also expanded to include others. But they're offering a sort of alternative to this despotic American-led system that includes, you know, like the World Bank, the IMF, and all these other financial institutions whose sole purpose is to prevent the development and autonomy and sovereignty of other countries. But we're seeing that being challenged now on a global stage. So you're talking about these people-powered movements in America. How do you see these movements and these political trends shaping out on the global stage?
Well, I think that's the question of the hour, Bryce. What's happening today? I feel this, I know Aaron does too, in my conversations with him. The American empire, the system of control, global control, is fragmenting now. You know, the great singer, the late singer Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I believe the system is cracking more and more every day. I think the presidential race that's shaping up is an example of this. On the one hand, the Democrats, you have this old guy, Biden, who's clearly not ready for prime time to run again. He's too old, he's too doddering, he's too weak. They won't let him out of the White House to debate people, to have live events. Even now,
So he'd walk off stage.
they're afraid of what he would do or not do. You have this blustering faux populist, Donald Trump, who only is jacked up in the polls by all his legal indictments. And he'll probably win if it's against Biden in next year, which would be, I think, a disaster for the country, would be even more divisive. I think he'd be a weaponized Donald Trump. He'd be angrier. He'd be more powerful. He would have learned from his last 4 years when he didn't take sufficient control. I think he will take dictatorial control this time around if he's reelected next time. So, look, I think the only hope at this point is an outsider who really gets it, who can peel off some of the votes from Donald Trump and run as Bobby Kennedy is running, Jr. And, people attack him, this and that. The media is freaked out about him. The DNC, the corporate media, the DNC is freaked out about him because he's taking on all the power centers. He's taking on the military-industrial complex. He's taking over Ukraine and Biden's priorities, militaristic, I think, policies. He's taking on big pharma. He's taking on the corporations in general, corporate control of Washington and the regulatory agencies. So Bobby Kennedy has put himself, I think, at great risk, like his father, to run for president. He's a hero to me. He's courageous. Thank God he has better protection than his father did, but it's mostly or all private. The Biden administration refuses him outrageously, in my mind, Secret Service protection so far. So despite his high standing in the polls. So I think this country is hanging by a thread, to tell you the truth. And because I have kids, one in their 20s, one in the early 30s, I have a stake in the future of this country. And I worry about the future if we can't resolve these problems peacefully and do it through great leadership, because frankly, it does come down to really visionary, great leadership, brave leadership, then we're fucked. Because we have so many things going against us, racial divisions, this commitment to spending on wars, money on wars that are just, like you said, Ukraine is turned into a fiasco. And so if humanity again and again chooses greed and violence over love, over diversity, over peaceful coalition coexistence, then we're fucked. We've got to decide at some point that climate change is real, that war is a thing of the past, that we all have to live on this small planet together. And if we don't do that, we're in grave danger.
Hear, hear. And I think with that, we can call it a wrap for our first discussion with David Talbot here on Devil's Chess Club. Bryce and David, it was a real pleasure, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryce.
It's my pleasure as well. And it was great to meet you, David.
Yeah.
Trying not to fanboy out too much.
I accept. As a child of Hollywood, I accept your adoration.
Excellent. We're back here for a postscript here of sorts, because we wanted to really introduce the Devil's Chess Club and its inspiration and founder, basically, David Talbot. But we didn't really introduce ourselves, and not everybody is going to be familiar with our work. So I'd like to start with you, Bryce Green. Can you tell the audience, give us a brief rundown on your background and how you came to have an interest in all these heavy materials dealing with the U.S. empire and the hidden covert state and all of that?
All right. Well, as Aaron said, I'm Bryce Green, and my background is, not as extensive as some other people's, but I started learning.
Let's clarify. How old are you, Bryce?
I'm 25. Currently 25. Currently in grad school. Well, we went to the same school, or I guess I'm going to your alma mater. But but I got I got interested in politics after, I was always interested in, like, basic liberal politics. Like, I would get together and watch the presidential debates, and I'd be listening to NPR every day, which, I still do, but I'm more frustrated now. But I didn't really understand the gravity of the forces that are, that we'd be fighting against. I didn't understand that, both parties are captured by, the corporate state and all that stuff. What led me to it was, well, I guess the big thing that pushed me that way was I heard a podcast where I learned that corporations had the ability to sue countries for infringing of their profit making through these international trade agreements. And I was like, wait, what? They can just do that and no one talks about it, and that's not even an issue for debate? And then from there, I started like reading more, learning more, picked up Noam Chomsky, learned about America's quest for global dominance, learned about the way the media is able to manipulate reality and falsify history and manufacture consent for a population to support some of the worst policies of empire. And watching that process in real time by reading the news and understanding the context that's missing is really I think, an educational process, and it blew my mind wide open. And so I started learning about, more about America's history, reading about the CIA, and I started at the end of my undergraduate career. I started writing for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which is a media watchdog magazine that really kind of serves as a bunch of case studies in manufacturing consent. Right, you learn about how the first piece I wrote was about how the New York Times downplayed the role of U.S. sanctions in Venezuela's healthcare crisis, and it's just little things like that that go on to paint a larger picture of a benign U.S. empire, and it really, you're watching history being falsified in action.
I
Uh,
think you mean that it falsifies the picture of the benign U.S. empire.
well, I mean, yeah, that the distortions, they paint that picture of a benign U.S. empire,
Right,
and
right, yeah, I got you.
yeah, and as I said in our interview, I was learning about the history, learning about the CIA, learning about intelligence, and then I picked up David Talbot's book, and then you learn about the Kennedy assassination. It was the first time I had heard the term like deep state mentioned in a serious way. It was the first time I heard the name Peter Dale Scott. It was the first time I knew that there were credible alternative stories of the Kennedy assassination. You hear this stuff in the ether, but respectable people are able to ignore that without investigating it, and so that's what I was. Uh, but learning about the Kennedy assassination, learning not only that they did it and that they covered it up, but that it is impossible to seriously talk about that in the current context today. That's a very radicalizing thing to figure out. And so from there, I started reading more, learned more about, you know, uh, the different deep events, Watergate, 9/11, Iran Contra, especially. I mean, you don't learn about Iran Contra in school. You don't learn about the drug trafficking, terrorist wars that we waged in Central America. And so learning about this stuff has given me a new perspective on how democracy works, about how America works, and the role that individuals play in or could play in maybe fixing things. So that's how I got here, and that's how I met Aaron.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here, and I really like the idea of you in Bloomington of all places because I love Bloomington. It's one of my favorite places in the country, and one day I'll get back there. I did get my political science degree in Bloomington, and then I went to Taiwan for a year to teach English, and came back, and then right then 9/11 happened, and went down to Bloomington and stayed at my buddy's place for a while, and I met my wife down there. She would become my wife later. And I got to sort of stay in Bloomington for a few years and not do much that was really productive. I didn't want to find a political job and I didn't want to move away from my girlfriend at the time. So I really got to spend a good bit of time in Bloomington. Like almost got a second, like an encore for my college years. It was actually really, I'm glad that I did in retrospect because I could have gone into some sort of job or career, but like my gut was just like the corporate world sucks. And So I didn't do that, and I went into did other jobs, education. We moved out to the East Coast when she finished, and I worked in politics. I worked on the campaign in 2004, low level position. '08, I was an Obama organizer. I went to the inaugural ball, and I was all about Obama, and I'm baffled about that now, but I'm kind of thankful in a way because it really forced me to do things that are useful in terms of like organizational skills and people skills. It was beneficial to me, but I felt betrayed by Obama when he ended up being basically another 8 years of George Bush. And I heard Oliver Stone talking on Bill Maher about this new book, JFK and the Unspeakable. I remembered seeing JFK and the Unspeakable, or not, seeing Oliver Stone's JFK film in the theaters, and then watching it on VHS right afterwards. And I was about in eighth grade at the time. So it resonated with me. I read the book, JFK and the Unspeakable, and on my bookshelf, I already had David Talbot's book, Brothers. And I read that one. And between the two of them, I thought, my gosh, we're out here doing all this work to get someone elected, like that's going to matter. But like when it comes down to it, if Obama is the president and is able to become the president and remain the president, it's because some other powerful force has decided not to veto his life, like they vetoed Jack Kennedy's life. And this is profound when you think about the implications for it. It suggests that the democracy is not really in the driver's seat, that there's some other force. And so I encounter people like Vance DeHaven Smith, radical scholars trying to look at things like the Kennedy assassination and Iran-Contra, Watergate, 9/11, and the clandestine state. And I started working with him, and I went to graduate school at Temple, and I got a PhD, wrote a book on the lawlessness of the American deep state, the American empire. American Exception, Empire in the Deep State. It's a book published by Skyhorse. I was teaching high school. I think I may have become too radical for this high school. Was basically told I was overqualified, and it was quite a thing. But I'm glad in a way that I left for many reasons, because I can pursue this work, and I set up the podcast. I got to interview a lot of great people. Got to work with Peter Dale Scott. Wrote some articles with him. Even he's a hero of mine. Really brilliant guy. Did the most serious work on these issues academically throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. So really a legend. It's been awesome. It's been awesome to get to work with people like this and talk about these things day to day. Even though it's grim, but I have the disposition for it that I just can't not talk about these things. And I also have a son, and I think like, man, if you're not trying to like fix this, what are you doing? So, and I'm thrilled. I'm an academic, and I'm a media person because that's where I've been sort of forced to work, which it's been a good thing. But with the campaign, the RFK campaign, I've tried to support him, even though that's not quite normal for an academic or someone in media. But my thinking on this is like, I can't even be in academia because you can't tell under the system, you can't even tell the truth about the most consequential things. And that there has to be some major change, and in the system to deal with this, the counter enlightenment that we live under. And so that's David and I both came to similar conclusions about RFK Jr. based on his background and what we think he wants to do, which I don't see as the end game of where we should be ultimately, but I think we have to have some way of winding down this empire. And I hope that my work would inform the way that might happen, or the way that people understand it, or I would contribute to the bigger sense that other people have done, people who've been around longer than me and done more than me, that we all might be sort of building something that as things fall apart, and this other superstructure of myth and historical epistemology, these histories that we write and these narratives that prevail, they're going to get falsified. And so what's going to be left standing? I think these critical narratives are they're going to remain when the bullshit fades away that we've been subjected to, and the myths all get falsified. I think this work is going to be important, and I hope that to have been able to contribute to it in some way. I'm really happy that we're going to be embarking on this together, Bryce, and you show courage for taking this kind of subject matter on, so I salute you for that.
Yeah, maybe it's courage, or maybe I just don't have good, sense of consequences. But I'm glad to be doing it anyway. I mean, it's not every day where you can go around and talk to people about these sorts of things. I mean, eh, when I learned that Kennedy was, assassinated by elements within our own government, I was telling my friends, I was like, "Hey, but don't you think anything of this?" I have
We
friends who
should
work
do
in
something about
politics, and
this.
yeah, I was like, like at the very least, we should like try to figure out and learn more about it. But they're like, whatever. Maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't, but it doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
I had a guy who was a grad student. We were at an Oliver Stone conference, and he was a fanboy and yet somehow skeptical of JFK story. And he said he was a nice enough guy, but he said to us he had a little bit of wine and he wasn't sloppy or anything like that. And he said, "So what I don't understand is like if you know that like the CIA killed JFK, like why don't you like do something about it? You know, like don't you feel like you got to do something about it?" And I was so I threw my punch on him. No, I didn't. I just was like, well, you know, they're kind of a little more powerful than us, but if we're just trying to spread the word, maybe that might help.
It's
But
like, well, do you have any suggestions for what to do next?
it's like, yeah, you're right. Now that you mention it, we should do something. Let's go and have a revolution. Well, that's not really realistic, unfortunately. Well,
Yeah.
we can wrap this up here unless you have any
Well,
final words,
first, I
Bryce.
want to be clear. I want to be clear. I am not a podcaster. I am a guy who is on a podcast, but don't call me a podcaster. Let it be known.
Yes, I accept that I cannot but be called a podcaster, but it's not my first way that I think of myself in my own identity. I don't identify as a podcaster first and foremost, but I do have a podcast and I hope that people like it and I hope that people enjoyed this one today. So, Bryce, and for David Talbot, I'm Aaron Good. Thank you very much, everybody who's tuned in for this first episode of Devil's Chess Club. Special thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode. This is the first time I have run the StreamYard app myself, so apologies for anything wacky going on during the video. We're all on a journey here. If you enjoy the episode of Devil's Chess Club, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. You'll get not only Devil's Chess Club, but the American Exception podcast as well, with around 150 episodes so far dealing with the deep, dark politics of the U.S. empire. We have an oral history series with the great Peter Dale Scott, a series on the JFK assassination, and interviews with people like Oliver Stone, Dan Ellsberg, Pepe Escobar, Lawrence Wilkerson, James Galbraith, Jim DiEugenio, Dick Russell, Robert Kennedy Jr., and many more. One last thing here that kind of blows my mind. I can't believe that David saw Ricky Henderson break the all-time stolen bases record in Oakland. That just blows my mind for some reason. I had to quickly put it out of my thoughts, or we never would have gotten to these other fun subjects like the Kennedy assassinations or the gradual disintegration of U.S. hegemony and all that. Friends, remember that while it may seem grim, every empire eventually loses on the devil's chessboard.